Okay. Hey everybody, welcome to today's talk. This is a series of talks on how to make trauma super easy. Understanding trauma super easy. Okay, before I get started, just a quick hello, welcome back everybody. I can see some familiar faces, which is absolutely awesome. Great to have you back. Today's talk is all about 11 signs you may have unhealed trauma. Now, these are very common signs. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use my story to set the scene. And the most powerful thing about stories, of course, is you can then potentially see yourself and your own experiences within that story without it re-traumatizing you. Now, we believe here at the Trauma Mentor Academy that trauma is an inside-out job. It starts with you. It starts with your internal world. And that doesn't matter if you are a client or if you're an individual working on yourself or whether you are a professional like myself. Trauma works from the inside out. It's about you delving inside and exploring what is going on in your world. Now, I always say why trauma is so complicated and why so many people aren't going into the mentoring role and being able to mentor themselves into recovery, into healing, is just purely because there is a knowledge gap. As I said earlier on, people make trauma really complicated. They make it a very complicated subject. It's very difficult to understand. It's got big words. You can't ever put it into context, into your own experiences easy. So we believe, absolutely, hand on heart, that trauma, recovery and healing is an inside-out job. We also believe that trauma, recovery and healing is an ongoing journey. A bit like if you went to Alcoholics Anonymous or if you're in a recovery program for drugs. Trauma is a journey. It's a process. You can't just snap your fingers and think, oh, that's it, it's dealt with. There are layers and layers and layers of trauma, and being in I like to think that you are in recovery so you can keep an eye on what's going on in your internal and external well, so we also believe that trauma is an ongoing journey and that it's a really good practice to be mindful of what's playing out in your world. We also believe, of course, why wouldn't we, that every individual, regardless of money, background, where they are in the world, we all have the ability to be able to recover and heal. That's my cat, sorry. You've been fed. Wait, get off my slides. Come on. Wait, no. As I said, what's often missing is the knowledge gap. It's understanding how you can recover and heal that's missing. That's what we're going to look at. We're going to take a closer look at the knowledge gap here to help you to put the pieces of the jigsaw together. There's no reason why people can't have access to this knowledge, the education, the training. Where people often get stuck, of course, is the willingness to take the action and to implement what it is that they need to implement. Okay, so our approach at the Trauma Recovery Academy is that we have a person-centered approach to working with people. That means we work with whatever they are presenting us with. We don't go deep diving into their personal history. We only deal with what it is that they are dealing with in the here and now that is getting in their way. So in effect, what we do is we create a safe space that provides a framework that enables them to be able to receive the additional tools and support and techniques it is that they need to be able to recover and heal. But ultimately, the power is in the client's hands. What we do is we give tools, techniques to help them gently unfold the trauma it is that they've experienced. Okay, so my story is triggering. It is a very heavy story. And I wanted to just skim over the surface of it because there's so much in it. So many people can relate to so many different aspects of my story, which I think is really helpful when you're dealing with your own trauma. One of the key skills about being a trauma recovery mentor is that you are able to share, not everything, just what is relevant with the person that you're working with, some of the experience that it is that you've had, so they can relate their own experiences and understanding to be able to process some of the emotions and the experiences they've had. So it's about carefully knowing the time and the place to share what it is that you need to share. So I just want to give a trigger warning here. And that is, if you find yourself feeling overwhelmed with emotion, you've become angry, frustrated, you're finding you feel really uncomfortable and you feel like you need some help, you absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, need to take personal responsibility for reaching out and getting that help. It's absolutely part of your recovery process. It's part of the ongoing journey of trauma recovery and healing, is making sure that you're not keeping it to yourself, you're not keeping those emotions and what you're feeling to yourself, but you're actually reaching out to the appropriate people and asking for help. So whether that's your doctor, whether that's your friends, whether you want to drop me a message, you need to reach out and start to make sure that you have a really good support network around you. Okay, so move that slide. Let's start then with setting the scene and going into my personal. It doesn't sound right. Is that right? Is that even a word? My story. Okay, my story. To set the scene and to help you to understand and to put things into context. Okay, so what I don't want to do is go too much into it, so I'm going to skim across the surface of it. Also, of course, when you're in recovery, you need to take responsibility for protecting your own emotions and your own feelings. So you have to be in a space where you're comfortable to be able to share. I'm very comfortable with sharing my story. So much so that I actually wrote a book called Be More Wolf, A Survivor's Story, Breaking the Trauma Cycle. And within that book, I talk about the 4 repeatable steps that you can use to start to break that grip of trauma. So you can start to recover and heal. You can pick a copy up from Amazon. I think it's currently $9.99. It was $14.99. It's been reduced for a bit. People often say, I'm stuck, I don't know what to do next, I'm exhausted, I'm overwhelmed, I need the help, but I'm just not getting it. This book will be absolutely perfect because in chapter 5, I go through all the exercises that I use to be able to recover and heal. And from that, I've been able to create the Trauma Mentor Recovery Academy, which is where I train other people to become trauma recovery mentors. Without my own process, I wouldn't have been able to do that. I also run a certification program as well that is 6 months long, where people become practitioners and then they can use the methodology with their clients. I show them how to set up the business in terms of creating their offers, packaging them. But that certificate is really where I work with you and you go through the process for yourself. So you're also clearing out at the same time what it is you need to clear, while at the same time as working with other people. And yes, you can absolutely do that. Absolutely. As long as you've got really firm boundaries and you know what you're dealing with. I think the problem arises for me when people start judging other people and saying that you can't work with people until you're healed. I don't think that's true, actually. And I think part of the problem within this area of expertise, within this area of help and support, is that we have become a bit snobby about how people can access support. Now, what happens when that's playing out is it means is that hundreds of thousands of people are not getting access to the support they need at that moment in time because they're waiting for 6 months on a waiting list to see and get an assessment or join a support group. I want to turn that around. I'm not into that game at all. I don't think you need to, I think you need to have very clear boundaries. I think you need to have the training. I think you need to have constant supervision. So all of those things in place. We're coming at trauma recovery and healing from a very different angle. Okay, my story, let's get into it. Okay, so I have experienced multiple layers of trauma, complex trauma over the years. I'm a big believer that anxiety breeds more anxiety, stress breeds more stress. Trauma, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, breeds more trauma if it's not dealt with, because the brain has a certain way that it processes the experience that you have had. Let's start with my story then. So when I was a young child, I was taken into local authority care. Both my parents were alcoholics. They would have a habit of leaving me and my brother in different locations, forgetting that they'd taken us out, and the police would have to pick us up, and then we would be taken back to them. Eventually what happened was there was an accident at home when I went to school, nursery. It got out what had happened. Police came and removed us, and we went into local authority care. So over my lifetime, I've experienced emotional abuse, neglect, abandonment, addiction as a child, sexual abuse, assault, rape. I've lived in poverty, which has created a survival mindset, and also experienced disability discrimination as well. There are some others I could tag onto there, but I haven't. So the UK care system, social services, school, and the mental health system absolutely failed me without a shadow of a doubt. And it is very sad to read that it is still failing people to this day. I read an article the other day which was acknowledging just that social services isn't fit for purpose. So I experienced abandonment. So I was locked in a cupboard for long periods of time, force-fed Valium. I've had over 30 foster placement breakdowns, an adoption breakdown, plus sexual abuse by other children and predatory staff in the children's homes. But it didn't stop when I left care, as I had to fend for myself. I went into supportive living. The care home locked when I went into supportive living. So basically, when you come out of care, when you're 15 and a half, 16, you go into an environment where you're taught independent living skills. I didn't get that. I went to a woman who locked the cupboards, turned off the heating, had absolutely no interest in me whatsoever. She had no intention of teaching independent living skills. So I moved from that placement. I moved into a flat. Before that, I actually moved into some other flats, and then I had to keep moving because of other circumstances without my control. But the flat I moved into, I was raped by my flatmate and his friends. I was sexually abused by my boss. I became homeless. Trauma really should have been called my middle name. This is what I mean about trauma breeds more trauma. You end up in situations whereby you are, because you don't know any better. You know, I was never taught that I shouldn't be in those situations. For me, I was just rolling with the punches. It was next, get up, next, get up, next, get up, next. So I never really digested what was happening to me. So trauma breeds more trauma. Absolutely. If it's not acknowledged dealt with, and you're able to change your perception around what's happened and learn how to move forward. Otherwise, what her tendency happens is you end up behaving from what's happened in the past because you don't know any better, and the brain has a certain way in the body that it remembers those experiences. So it's a double-edged sword, because whilst it will do its best to keep you safe and out of situations, it will also put you in situations as well that aren't helpful for you either, like this one. So after all of that, you'd think I'd be sick to death of social services, wouldn't you? But what I did later on was I reinstitutionalized myself back into social services. And as an adult, I worked with young people at risk for over 20 years. That was within the voluntary sector and the statutory sector. So I was in social services as a placements officer. And of course, what that did was it kept on re-triggering me. Re-triggering. It's all I knew. It was like a parent. So I'd reinstitutionalize myself again. Over those years, I also lost 3 jobs due to dyslexia discrimination, which eventually led to crippling anxiety and depression in my 30s. I've had a couple of quite serious depressive episodes, and also anxiety to the extent where I couldn't actually leave the room for quite a long time, my bedroom. So what I discovered was that there was nothing normal about the way I had been living my life. When I started my trauma recovery and healing journey, I quickly learned that I had become consumed and swallowed up by trauma's damaging effects, that I had shaped my whole life around traumatic events and experiences. I was living my life through the filter of trauma. It had become the dominant side of my personality and was in control of my everyday life. The shift in my perspective is the difference that made the difference. So I talk about this in the book in terms of how the mind deals with trauma, and when it's out of control, how unhealthy it can become, and what we need to do to manage that level of trauma it is that we're experiencing. So 3 months into the pandemic, and I clearly remember thinking to myself, now you know what it feels like. With the level of stress and the overwhelm and the havoc that the pandemic was causing in everyone's lives, for some reason, it felt like what it was like to grow up in the UK care system. It was chaotic, crazy. You didn't know what you're doing. Everything was upside down. You didn't know what was coming at you one day to the next. You never felt safe. You were always on edge. So I started to make the connection between the trauma I had experienced and the devastating effects on the pandemic that were playing out around the world. So for the first time, I started to have this overwhelming sense that I was no longer alone. To me, that sounds really crazy, but I've heard someone else say this recently who has a similar background to me, and I just thought that was really fascinating. Sorry, my cat's playing. So how could that be? In my head, I came up with a story that other people would now be able to understand and relate to the pain I had endured as a child, as a teenager, and in adult life. Now the world had pretty much lost the plot. Lives were turned upside down, as I said, and in chaos, I finally felt that I had a connection with the rest of the world. I knew I could help people to get back on their feet because I had learned how to recover and heal, not only from trauma, but that also of countless others as well over the years. I've worked in frontline services with young people for over 20 years in the statutory and voluntary sector. When you combine that with my own lived experience of complex trauma, you're in safe, insightful, and knowledgeable hands. While trauma, as I said, can be very complicated, subject, we often make things way too complicated, so it becomes difficult for the average person to figure out. Trauma happens, as I said earlier on, to be one of those subjects that is so complicated. And because it's complicated, it means it's really difficult to get access to good services that are going to help you in the here and now. So I'm going to do my best to absolutely simplify trauma. So as I said, fear breeds more fear, anxiety breeds more anxiety, trauma breeds more trauma. It's an emotional loop that feeds in on itself if left unresolved and unmanaged. But not many people, including myself, really understand or were taught how to recognize and manage the long-term damaging effects of trauma. It's really interesting. I need to pull out these stats and put them into this talk. The amount of people who have experienced trauma, now I need to find this out to make sure it's factual, and it depends on what part of the world you're in. I was reading something the other day and it was like 1 in 5 people, 1 in 5. But the amount of people that go, I don't know anybody who's experienced a traumatic event to such a degree. I don't know anybody. Isn't it absolutely fascinating? I think it's because people just do not know what to look for. People don't talk about experiences enough for us to be able to understand that there is actually an epidemic. Okay, not the right word. You know what I mean. There are so many people suffering with trauma, the effects of trauma, that it hinders them from being able to reach their true potential. That puts stress on the family, it puts stress on work. It means that they are constantly stuck in an emotional loop and aren't able to move past it, because that is the way the body and the brain works. It's no fault of their own, it's just how we're hardwired. Okay, so the Collins English Dictionary describes trauma as a very severe shock or very upsetting experience which may cause psychological damage. What I would say is that it's an event that has happened to you whereby it's been difficult, challenging, horrendous. It could be something that you have witnessed, it could have happened to you. I believe we are, if you've been watching the news for the last couple of years and you've seen the devastating effects of the pandemic play out, it's almost like we are in a collective traumatic experience because we've been pumped with so much fear. Trauma for me is an event that's happened that it's left a thumbprint on your personality, on your identity, which means that you've changed the way you think, you've changed your behavior to such a degree that that event has changed things for you moving forward. So in effect, what's happening is that the traumatic event has happened, and what tends to happen is as we live our lives, our brain is constantly going backwards to that traumatic event because it hasn't been resolved, because we haven't done any work around sorting it out. And then the brain's really sneaky. It will do its absolute best to make sure that you avoid sorting it out. It doesn't matter how much emotional pain you're in, it will put a barrier up and say, no, I don't want to look at this. And it can cause havoc, it can cause all sorts of problems. But all of those problems, apart from illness, a lot of the time are just an illusion. They're a false negative. What's happened is that experience has left such a deep thumbprint on your identity and personality, the way you do things, is that it keeps repeating itself, it keeps getting in the way. What we want to do is we want to release you from that and help you to move forward to make more up-to-date decisions based on the here and now, not based on that traumatic event that's happened in the past. Okay, so just take a second and have a think about, stop the video here. Have a think about a challenging or a difficult event in your life that you're happy to share, that you're happy to have a conversation with yourself about. In the book, I will talk about self-coaching, a self-coaching process that you can go through to help you have a conversation with yourself. So you don't even need to share it with anybody else, a conversation with yourself where you can get under the skin of what's playing out. But for this exercise, just have a think about a challenge in your life that you're happy to talk to yourself about. What I would do is get a pen and paper, 2 colored pens, pen and paper, and just write down like you're having a conversation with yourself. Okay, Wendy, what was a challenging and difficult event in your life that you're happy to share? Write the answer down. And then, of a colored pen, how did that event impact your relationships? Answer the question, change pen, so you can see the dialogue between yourself. What this does is it helps create a little bit of emotional distance from what it is that you are exploring and taking a look at. So it's a bit of more of a healthier way to look at it. And the nice thing about this is working this way is that you can get under the skin of what's happening pretty quickly, because you know what buttons to press, you know how you're going to try and get out of things, you know that you're not, you know if you're not asking yourself an honest question or not. It's really, really powerful. And this is where trauma mentoring recovery comes in. This is such a gift. So how did you change your behavior from that event? Did you avoid people or places? How did your beliefs change? If we were in a group setting, I would be asking you for feedback. Piece of paper, write this down, because what this will do is it'll help you to very quickly see how something very small can have such a profound effect on the way you are now managing your life. And quite often, that very small thing could be the thing that's keeping you stuck in a situation that you don't necessarily want to be in. And the reframing, the reprocessing, if you think of trauma like a filing cabinet, so your brain's like a filing cabinet, and you've got all of these lovely drawers, they're all sorted out, they're all tidy. Well, my drawers are anyway. They're all tidy, all sorted out. Then you've got this one drawer that is an absolute mess, and you're too frightened to go in there and have a look at it because there's just so much crap in it that it's just like terrifies you to look at it. So when you start doing exercises like this, when you start having conversations with yourself like this, what starts to happen is that filing cabinet starts to sort itself out. It's starting at a deep unconscious level to actually start filtering some of the information out that hasn't been processed, and it starts to file it away in the place, in the drawer that it needs to be filed away in. Once that happens, is that you can then start working on changing your perspective, because you've looked at it from all angles. You can start to look at changing your perspective. You can then actually think about the here and now. What's going to work best for me now? What do I need to do to put my best foot forward? So you've filed away what it is that isn't working. Okay, so I've waffled on an awful lot. I love this subject, trauma. I am very mindful of time though, sorry. You can start and stop the video. Yeah, okay. 11 signs you may have unhealed trauma. Okay, so just have a think about the story it is that I've been through. I know it's an awful lot. And just think about, are there any similarities to your story, what it is that you've been through or someone else has been through? Can you see trauma in somebody else? Can you really just digest it, play with it, ask yourself what's coming up for you? What have you noticed? How have you felt it in your body? What's going on? So the 11 signs and 11 signs I've picked out of unhealed trauma relate to the story it is that I have just told you. Real life story though, unfortunately. So the first thing, and this is a huge one, and I touched on it just slightly not so long ago, and that was denial. Denial that it ever happened. People will say things like, well, it wasn't that bad. They had it much worse than me. I wouldn't change my life for anything. At least that didn't happen. So we will naturally go into denial about what has happened to us. I did it for 40 years plus. I denied that any of those horrific things that happened to me. It was just, that's how life was. I didn't even know it was trauma. So it took a long time for me to admit that things were really bad and bad things had happened. So it's really natural for people to deny what has happened to them because the brain just wants to keep you safe. It's going to do its best not to put you in harm's way. But as I said, it's like a double-edged sword. In one respect, it doesn't want you to go over old ground, old territory, old wounds. But on the other hand, it's stopping you in everyday life to such a degree that it can be so emotionally painful and so difficult to deal with that denial, to me, is the biggest one that I see. So, oh no, I'll go on to the second one. Expression of self, the second one. I see this a lot with the clients I work with. So I didn't know how to safely express my thoughts. I was frightened to speak out in front of people. I remember when I was at work in training, I don't know if you've ever been training at work and they normally put you in a circle and they'll go around and they'll ask you, what's your name? What do you do? Or some little icebreaker that'll do to warm the group up. And the palms of my hands would be sweating. I'd feel sick. I'd want to run. It was just horrendous. And every time someone said a name, it was getting closer and closer and closer to me. So I'd feel terrified. And I could feel the tension rise in my body. So this was a clear sign that there was some level of unhealed trauma playing out, because that's not a normal, although I didn't know it at the time, that's not a normal experience for most people. 3, self-worth and esteem, self-esteem. So confidence, I've always had a lot of confidence, but my self-esteem and my self-worth were in the gutter. So I felt that I was disposable. I had been passed from pillar to post as a child. I constantly compared myself to other people. I felt that I was not good enough, smart enough, intelligent enough. I consistently felt less than anyone else. Again, this to me is another indicator. Now, I think what's important to say here is that what I've seen is that someone will have something traumatic happen, and then there will be a bubble of these other things that fit around, that have created their behavior and their identity around that experience. So you wouldn't look at this in isolation. You would be looking at moving parts. So you could have low self-esteem and self-worth, but it may not necessarily be related to trauma. So it's thinking about context. What's the context? What's the story? What's the person? Looking at a person holistically. Relationships. So I was unable to manage personal relationships of any kind. I kept people at a distance. I was only ever able to work with people one-to-one. I couldn't work with people in a group. If I got close, I would push people away. I was paranoid. I felt that people were out to get me. So this is how the trauma played out on my ability to maintain relationships. Well, actually, I couldn't maintain relationships at all. Sorry, I just peeled the back off my gadget. as I was fiddling. I couldn't maintain relationships at all. That was a real challenge. So number 5, mental health. So what happened was I would push myself so hard that I pushed myself into burnout, severe anxiety, depression. I would play things over in my head over and over again. I was unable to stop it. So I had these ruminating thoughts, they call them, where you have a thought in your head and you just can't get rid of it, and it just keeps playing like a stuck record playing over in your head. So I basically pushed myself so hard that, as I said, I ended up with anxiety and episodes of depression. And that was because I was trying to prove myself all the time. So pushing myself. Well, I actually had nothing to prove, but because of the trauma that had played out and because of unmet needs as a child, that's what I would do. And lots of people do this. It's very common. So making excuses, this is a classic. I always know there's something funky playing out when this happens. I can't do that. That won't work. That goes against my values. There's such a level of internal resistance to doing something that people get well and truly stuck. It's either, I was going to say right, but that's left. It's either left or right or wrong, up or down. There's no middle. What we do as trauma mentors, recovery mentors, is we help people to get into the color, into the middle of their life. So they're moving away from having a fixed mindset into a growth mindset. So we're freeing up their personality to be able to see life through color, so it's not so harsh. So that internal resistance, when I work with women and they go, I can't do that, that goes against my values, there's something funky playing out. So we have to just get underneath it gently, which is fine because that's what it does. I say, okay, 7, confidence. I've just mentioned on this a minute ago, is that I would constantly be seeking other people's approval, and I would take things to heart. So even though I did have confidence, I took things personally, which you could argue comes down to self-esteem and self-worth. And it was just that constantly seeking for approval. You know, with my boss, I'd be constantly seeking my boss's approval. I didn't care about anyone else's, but in terms of how the hierarchy went within an organization, or who I was answerable to, because they had the power and I needed to survive, I would be constantly seeking for approval, which was absolutely devastating when I had a manager or managers that I just did not get on with. 8, another sign, playing victim, a sense of hopelessness. So I would constantly be stuck in a loop and would repeatedly say to myself, why am I not getting this? And I hear people say this, I hear women say this a lot, why am I not getting this? What am I not getting? I don't know what I need to do. I didn't realize at the time that I was terrified actually of becoming successful. And the why was I not getting this was a way for me to keep myself safe. It kept me in victim, it kept me feeling helpless. So I associated being successful with experiencing more abuse. The more successful I would become, the more abuse I would experience. This is another classic. This is an absolutely big one for so many people, and it is emotionally abusing themselves. It is when somebody speak so critically of themselves, so negatively of themselves, like they're punishing themselves, they're judgmental of themselves and other people. Something funky is happening, something funky is playing out. We have a 0 tolerance. We do not tolerate at all any emotional abuse of self or of other people. We do not tolerate putting ourselves down, or we don't tolerate actually putting other people down as well. because it says more about us than it does them. But that emotional abuse of self is basically a protective layer. It's just, it happens naturally to try and protect you, to try and keep you safe and others out of your way. And you'll find that, you know, like attracts like. You'll end up making mates with somebody else who is very critical. It's not healthy, it's not good for you, and you need to adapt a zero tolerance policy, like I do, and like my clients do, and like we do at the Trauma Recovery, Trauma Mentor Academy, or Trauma Mentoring Recovery. 10, emotional well-being. So I was fearful of being seen. I'm very conscious that the light has gone down. So as I said, I was very conscious of being seen, because that to me meant that I was going to experience more abuse, which obviously I didn't want. No one would want. Then there was lights. Oh, blimey. What a boom. Fearful of being seen. So I would hide myself sophisticatedly behind other people. Now, I wouldn't eat properly. I'd eat one meal a day. I'd get up really early at 5 a.m. in the morning to start work. So my emotional well-being really suffered. And I see this a lot as well, is that people will hide themselves sophisticatedly behind other people, so they're not stepping forward, and they will sophisticatedly hide. Like I used to do it. I used to create courses. I would hide in content. You wouldn't see me. You wouldn't really see me. You wouldn't see what I believed in, what I stood for a level of vulnerability or strength. I would sophisticatedly hide, which took a tremendous toll on my emotional well-being. And number 11, the last one, addiction. So I became addicted to work because I needed to survive. I worked 14-hour days, and work was absolutely everything to me, because that is how I survived. If I didn't have my job, if I didn't have an income coming in, I was so fearful of becoming homeless again and what that would bring, that I became completely addicted and consulted and had no social life at all. So these are all signs that you can look out for, that will give you some indication of whether it's for you or for your clients as to what's playing out. So just have a think about, can you see any of the 11 signs playing out for you? Can you see them happening for your clients? What from those 11 signs, just jot down aha moments, thoughts. As I said, zero tolerance policy. No stinking thinking, we call it. No stinking thinking at all. Okay, so I'm going to bring this talk to a close. I've waffled on an awful lot, but I think these 11 signs and symptoms, when you put them in context to my own story, it shows the long-term damaging effect that trauma can have, because that behavior, the creation of my personality, that to that extreme, had been created because of all the trauma that I'd experienced as a child. So my personality, the way I did things, was all shaped around Mozzie time. It was all shaped around the traumatic events that I had experienced. Okay, so if you haven't got a copy of the book, make sure you grab a copy of the book, Be More Wolf, A Survivor's Story, Breaking the Trauma Cycle. In chapter 5, you will find a series of exercises that you can start to go through. If not, I'm hosting some training on the first Tuesday of every month, which is the introduction certificate to trauma mentoring. So trauma recovery mentoring. So if that's something that interests you, just pop across to the website, which is traumarecoverymethod.com, and you'll be able to get access to the future training that is coming up. But if you've got any questions, just pop them below. That would be absolutely awesome. And I look forward to seeing you at the next talk. Until then, take care.